Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We have an excellent conversation about to happen here. If this is your first conversation of the day, welcome to the Recruitment Automation Conference on Diversity and Inclusion. I am Dave Meppelberg, one of the organizers and also part of the Wade and Wendy team. I'm really excited for this conversation on combating bias in candidate evaluation. And it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the panel, CEO and founder of Pymetrics, Frida Polli. Frida, I will let you take it away.
Great. Thank you, Dave. So pleasure to be here, everybody. My name is Frida Polli. As Dave mentioned, I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Pymetrics. Pymetrics is the leader in the field of artificial intelligence that is designed from its core to be unbiased. And we accomplish that through a variety of ways, which I'm sure we'll talk about on this panel. More importantly, I have Carin Taylor with me here today, who is the head of diversity and inclusion at Workday, a company I'm sure you're all familiar with, and Merve Hickok, I'm sorry, I always mispronounce your name, Merve, who has an illustrious history, but is currently the founder of Ethical AI. Is that correct, Merve? I'm sorry, I'm going to mangle that as well, possibly. But I'm going to let both of you introduce yourselves and do a much better job than I just did, starting with you, Carin.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks so much, Frida, and thanks for the conference for having me. So my name is Carin Taylor, and I am the Chief Diversity Officer at Workday. Workday is a leading provider of enterprise cloud applications, finance, and human resources, and we deliver financial management and human resources planning and analytic applications. And so it's my pleasure to be here today. I'm really invested in this topic and this conversation, having done this work for a number of years, thinking about bias, particularly in the evaluation process, is something, frankly, that we struggle with a lot. And so I think what we're seeing is some of the outcomes of that. And so super interested and excited to be having this conversation with you today.
Merve, over to you.
My name is Merve Hickok. I'm the founder of AIethicist.org. Lighthouse Career Consulting. I'm a MSCP and was a VP in HR for Bank of America Merrill Lynch for long years. First as a country HR manager and then as diversity recruitment manager for Europe and Middle East. Our offices in Europe and Middle East. After 20 years in corporate world, I moved to do my own follow my own passions. One is I work with an organization, High Sierra Industries, developing learning systems and technologies for people with disabilities. And on the other side, AIethicist.org, where I do advocacy and awareness raising and consultancy on how to move towards a responsible and ethical AI development and implementation. And great to be here.
Perfect. Well, it's so great to have you. And Merve, we had a chance to chat about a lot of these topics a few weeks ago on a different panel that we did. But I want to start off with a topic that I think is super interesting. What is unconscious bias? How does it find its way into the evaluation process? And where does it manifest itself? Now, as a cognitive scientist, I have all sorts of thoughts I'd love to share, but I'm going to start with our esteemed panelists. Carin, do you want to start off with that one?
Sure. No worries at all. So I guess the first thing that I'd say about unconscious bias is we all have it, right? And unconscious bias is, we think about it, if you're human, you have bias. And as humans, we're really hardwired to make really quick decisions, and unconscious bias plays a part in that. And so as we're thinking about unconscious bias, it's really, I would sum it up as kind of the underlying attitudes and stereotypes that people unconsciously attribute to another group or person that affect how they actually think about that group. And so I think one of the things that's important about bias is that often biases, to some extent, kind of learned behaviors that we can be influenced in terms of media, what our personal experiences are, as well as the experiences that we hear from others. And so, and as we think about those biases and how we are triggered by them, we often make decisions based on what those biases are. And when we're thinking about that in the context of either recruiting or the evaluation process, those biases can creep into how we treat other people. So that's kind of how I'd sum it up. You might be on mute, Frida.
Yeah, you're on mute. Okay, I'll follow up on that.
Yep.
So can't add too much definition about what Carin said, other than just cognitive shortcuts that are helping us make decisions, and not based on actual knowledge of an individual or circumstances. Like Carin said, we all have it. It's more about taking intentional action and intentional steps to mitigate that and to fight that. Where I experience and where I see this coming in is looking at where making the decisions throughout the evaluation as well as recruitment process, where we look at where our applicant pools are coming from, how we make the decisions, what kind of criteria are important in that we put in our job applications, job descriptions, and how do we evaluate people. When we say culture fit, it's like, what is it that we mean? It becomes so subjective. It's not something that you can formalize or create objective criteria around it. And also it comes from just like quick snapshot decisions that we do without taking the individuality and the context of the applicants. And one of the panels, the panel before us mentioned, huge number of applications coming in, and how do you do that? Is that balance of, making sure that your processes and your decisions and your criteria and all the, filters that you put out there, whether through your process or through your software, is reviewed, and you challenge each other, your team, your hiring managers, your other recruiters, and not go with a group bias and expert.
And what I was going to say, Carin, after you spoke, is I'm going to give you guys both a great reference if you haven't heard of it already. Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, talks about basically system 1 and system 2 thinking. Again, I'm a cognitive scientist, so I'm a geek this way. And basically, unconscious bias is system 1 thinking, which, again, to your point, Carin, is, hardwired into every single brain that is born on this planet. So we all have it. And, it does have evolutionary purpose. It's for when you see a tiger, you don't want your slow system 2 process thinking, what is this tiger? What should I do with this tiger? You want it to say, tiger, run. But the problem with it is that it gets co-opted in all of these extremely problematic ways. I mean, we could go on and on about that. And in particular in recruiting, when to, the gentleman's point earlier, if you're going through thousands of resumes and you're spending 6 seconds on a resume, there's callback studies which submit resumes with either a white sounding name or an ethnic sounding name, show that literally just changing the name on a person's resume from John to Jamal, John gets 10 interviews and Jamal gets 7. And that is evidence for unconscious bias. It's just, it happens. And again, back to Merve's point, it's, process, metrics, accountability, technology, all of these things need to be put in place in order for us not to have that system kick in by default. So I think excellent points.
Yeah, and just one thing I would add there, like to put this into real terms, like an easy one that comes up often in the evaluation process is our perception on what university or college someone may have gone to, right? So if I see that a person comes in for an interview, I'm looking at a resume, and that person has gone to the same university that I went to, Absolutely. And had a really good experience, I'm going to lean towards that person, and my bias is going to say, if I'm a great person who did that, this person must be as well. And so it surfaces really, really easily, as well as we're thinking about the role that our recruiters play, right? Our recruiters can also be weeding out people in the process by name, by a certain trigger that they see on a resume that then allows certain people to not get through the system in terms of leveraging that bias as well.
Yeah, could not agree more. It goes beyond gender and ethnic bias, socioeconomic bias, elite school bias, all of that good stuff. Which takes us to the point. How do you measure bias in the evaluation process? Carin, you're going to get us started there because it sounds like you already have a lot of experience with this. So beyond the endpoint of diversity of hires, how do you measure it along the way? And I think there was some comments around this on the earlier panel, but would love to hear from both of you how you think about measuring the bias along the way of the evaluation process.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the easy ways, not just thinking about, the end state of what's happening, but what's happening through the entire process of the evaluation. So even from the beginning of how you source to how you're looking at who's getting through. So for me, a real easy way to measure is, do I have the same rate of people getting through the process and getting to that point of hiring as the rest of the demographics that I'm dealing with? And so I think that we also have to make sure that we're doing things like checking not even just checking our biases, but thinking about how are people getting through from certain managers, right? Are certain managers simply going with the same behaviors, and can we identify that that there could be some behavior in there that's not as inclusive as what we would like it to be? One of the things that I really also believe in is, how do you think about mitigating some of that bias in the process? And so if I think about things like, moving from one-on-one interviews to panel interviews as an example, right? Remember, when we're doing one-on-one interviews, it's our personal perception of what we heard and what we learned from the interview with that person, which may be completely different from the other interviewers. And so if we're not asking the same questions, if we're not looking for the same types of information, there's certainly an opportunity that we are not going to be evaluating people in the same way. So making sure that you are removing some of that bias. And the example of one-on-one versus a group interview is, in a group interview, we're all hearing the same thing, right? We may be interpreting it differently, but when we get back into that group and discuss that candidate, we can discuss what's happened based on what we all heard, even though we may have interpreted it a different way. So I think there are certainly opportunities to both evaluate as well as think about how you mitigate in the process as well.
I think that's a great points. Merve, what do you think?
Definitely everything that Carin said. Definitely going through the whole funnel and at each step, looking at the ratios, different types of ratios, but also looking at the breakdown of which universities your candidates are coming from, which degrees, which companies, which competitors. A lot of the times, especially in big multinationals and certain sectors, you go through this. Okay, I need to get the candidate in my competitor is better than the one that hasn't been to that competitor. So you just create that bias in your head. Definitely doing roundtables and panels and like checking in on each other's bias and challenging each other on that. But also looking at from the other end, not only looking at certain hiring managers' performance or their ratings and the trend around that, but also looking at your company's own composition in terms of, what are the wages, the promotions, the exits, and the composition within your own company that reflects on your hiring panels, the hiring decisions, etc. is crucial.
Yeah, and I don't have much to add other than that I think that just metrics are the one of the key components, because at the end of the day, you will not know what your pass rates are for different groups if you're not measuring it. And I think it's unfortunate that we don't have mandatory metrics reporting, because I think that would improve a lot. We're working towards that, but I think metrics are critical to this. So then moving on to, I think we have a big discussion, I think, happening in society at large as to the role of technology in many things. But in particular, when it comes to, mitigating bias in the evaluation of people, there's a lot of different thoughts out there. I've certainly been a part of many conversations where the thoughts are kind of all over the place. So I'd love to turn it over to you this time, Merve, to start us off. Where do you think technology, and then obviously go to you, Carin, how do you think technology, what role do you think it has in mitigating bias in the evaluation of candidates, and where do you see things going? And then I'll turn it over to you, Carin, afterwards. Oh, Merve, you're either on mute or you're far away from your microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
So on the positive side of the coin, on how to mitigate bias with technology, it gives us the ability, there are certain technologies out there that gives us the ability to kind of analyze our funnels, our data sets, and in ways that we wouldn't be able to do beforehand with the likes of Excel or basic business analytics, which then gives you the chance to intentionally develop your decisions, improve your processes, your metrics, as well as look at your, again, company's composition. It also provides you a way to evaluate once you have use a technology that is auditable, that you can trace back. You can actually audit back or trace back your decisions and look at it. You can't do that with just human recruiters or hiring managers, obviously. So it's open to audit and review after the fact. And also, look, talking about bias, you have the technology or tools to apply the same logic, the same filters to all applicants in matter of seconds or minutes, thousands of applicants, right? Yet, we're going to talk about the flip side of that, what happens. But at least you're making sure that everyone is getting the same treatment on the same criteria. And also, I think it kind of democratized the reach of certain jobs to different people around the country, in different regions. You can reach more candidates than we could with traditional methods.
Yeah. And how about you, Carin? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much. I agree totally with Merve said, and I don't have much more to add other than we really need to think about, how do we think about the use of the right technology in mitigating biases, right? Like not all technology is created the same. And so we really need to think about and do our homework around, is this technology really meeting the need that I need it to meet? And I'll just share a quick example. If you think about technology that claims that they can help you remove bias, but they can remove bias for how you deal with women at a greater rate than how they deal with that with some minorities or underrepresented minorities, then you really have to think about whether or not that technology is meeting the need of your company. And so what I would say is, in addition to what Merve said, is just make sure that you're doing your homework around it to make sure that you're using the right technology. The other thing that I'll say, and of course you, Frida, know this very well with the work that you've done with Pymetrics, is how do you create that level playing field, either through technology, through assessments, through, mitigating the inconsistencies in some of our processes where humans can actually bring that bias in. And how do you do that through technology? And there are a number of ways, like how do you remove, some identifiers from resumes? How do you create those assessments that are designed to really look at things beyond what we're seeing on a piece of paper? Right. So I certainly think technology plays a key role in that in terms of how we do it. And I think that, certainly there's a long way to go, right? When we think about things like AI and the impact of AI and how we use it with ethical behaviors and practices, you have to incorporate those in what you're doing from a mitigation perspective.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think that, there are platforms, Pymetrics being one of them, but HiredScore, Applied, and others being ones that I know about that really have built their technology with ethical principles in mind. And I think at this point, there is relative consensus about what those are. And I think auditing is a critical component. Auditing and exposing how your algorithms are performing, both pre-deployment, meaning before you release them, and then post-deployment, you need to track them once they've gone out in the wild, as I say. So it's not enough to just do it, before you put them out there, but then also, afterwards. And those platforms that I just mentioned, as well as ours, also do that. And so I do think that and then there's people are thinking about third-party audits, the importance of that. We are supportive of legislation in New York that would mandate reporting of the impact ratio that algorithms would have on gender and ethnicity, which we think is a critical component, again, back to the sort of transparency in auditing. So I do think that, and I'm curious to know if you guys would add other things to it, but I think, auditing, transparency, explainability, obviously is a big component of designing an ethical system. But I do think that we've sort of aligned on certain components or certain design features that sort of constitute ethical design versus not. And so I think maybe that brings us to the next question. And obviously, if you have other sort of design principles that you can think of, that was not an exhaustive list, but technology can be a double-edged sword, right? So if you're not designing technology with those principles and maybe other principles that you guys think are important, what can be, what's happening in that case? Carin, do you want to tell us your thoughts on that?
Sure. I start with a couple things. And the first thing is, how is technology being made, right? Who's making the actual technology? If you don't have diverse perspectives and diverse people in there helping you to build the technology, then it's likely that your technology is going to be built on your experiences, your biases, and that's what's going to be created. That's why when we think about diversity and inclusion and the importance of creating the technology, you really need to think about how are you going to get those diverse voices and experiences in there. The other thing that I would add is also, this whole notion of removing bias through technology is fairly new to us, right? Especially when it comes to hiring piece. How do we make sure that we continually review and evolve our practices around technology in mitigating some of these biases? All that piece to me is extremely critical, and that it's not just we come up with the technology today and think that that's the best thing, but that we continue to evolve based on what we're learning. And I think if we continue to do that, we'll make great stride and progress. But we have to remember it's a really new field for many of us, and how do we continue to evolve it?
Yeah, and couldn't agree more that continual evaluation of your software, which is why I was mentioning sort of post-deployment monitoring is critical, because again, you don't know how it's gonna perform over time. So we think that's critical. Merve, what would you add to that? I think, how can we think about it as a double-edged sword and potentially being problematic because it's enshrining existing biases?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what I said in the previous question of mitigating bias, turn that around, flip the coin. You're applying the same logics and filters to everyone. So instead of being able to, as a single recruiter or hiring manager, being able to do a single bad decision on your hire, now if you have bias embedded in your data set, in your model, in the software that you're using, now you're expanding that and magnifying that damage to thousands of people. There are liabilities and accountability issues around that. Yes, the legislation hasn't caught up yet, but it will. And at least from an ethical and responsible point of view, not restricting our behaviors with just compliance, we need to make sure that our data sets, softwares that we're using, are, to Carin's point, are the best tools to manage that problem, solve that problem, and then they're built responsibly. So if you're looking at doing extensive due diligence as recruiters or as decision makers, you're usually you're on the developer side, but a lot of the people on the panel, on the audience, I'm assuming, are on the implementer, on the user side, end user side. So just making sure that we do our due diligence and finally accepting what the vendor says. But what it does is these really cool things, this shiny packaging, and do all sorts of this analysis, emotional analysis. Not just start with that, but actually asking the right questions and doing the due diligence. And just one thing to follow up on Carin's point about the diversity of the voices of who's designing this, etc. We are looking at someone's word. At the end of the day, we're deciding someone's worthiness, right? We're deciding whether that person is worthy of hiring. That is a very subjective decision at any point. So we need to make sure that you're doing our best.
And you know what? So I'm going to just take one issue with what you said, Merve, and I've heard this repeated many times, but as a cognitive neuroscientist, I feel compelled to say something. I actually don't think that AI is more scalable than the human brain, because everybody, as we just mentioned, has a human brain, right? And we just talked about how it has that design flaw of unconscious bias, right? So I actually don't think that that's a true statement that AI is more scalable. I think what is more, because again, like everybody has a brain, and we know from 30 years of looking at callback studies that there's been no change in just adding Jamal versus John to a recruiter's behavior, right? But what I do think is problematic is that people believe algorithms to be objective. Like people don't think humans are objective. They know we're not. And so that I think is the bigger danger, is that people, and again, it's a lot of people, right? You call it an algorithm. It's back to, weapons of math destruction or math washing, right? I think that's the bigger danger, is that, to your point, a vendor will have said, oh, but it's unbiased and, blah, blah, blah. And I have lots of materials to support that. That I think is the bigger concern to me, is just that it is, it's the veneer of objectivity that I think is problematic. So then I'd love to add a question that wasn't on our initial list, but I'm actually really curious to hear what you guys think. What do you think? I mean, we're kind of in the Wild West right now of like anyone can say anything. I can say my algorithm's bias free. The next person can say it, like, who knows? And, we're sort of giving these heavy procurement manuals to folks in HR, where it's like subsection 3, paragraph B, it's like super complicated to follow all of this. You got to bring in the lawyers and you have to bring in the data privacy. I mean, if I were like, getting into this for the first time, my head would explode, right? So I don't think that is sustainable over time. And I think a lot of people think that. So what do you guys think in terms of, is it going to take regulation? Do you think it's a certification process through IEEE, which is working on it? Like, what do you think? And happy for either one of you to jump in, gets us to a place where there's a better guardrail around knowing if an algorithm is being fair or not. And I'd just be curious to hear what you guys think.
Let me jump in first. I'm right.
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
I'm writing about this.
I'm going off script here, but I think it's an important question that, that a lot of people think differently about. So.
No, absolutely. Like I said, I'm writing about this, so more than happy to talk.
There you
go. The way that I see it going is mix of both hard regulation as well as soft regulation.
Yep.
So far with big tech, with all the stuff, software is AI-powered software. A lot has depended on self-regulation, and like self-governance within the company, doing their best practices or whatever they're doing, but really not having anything that is coming outside of the company, either from the consumers or the regulators, with the exception of the scandals. So whenever there's a scandal, whenever something breaks, or an investigative journalist brings the story, surfaces, and then the consumer is able to, or the regulators, or whoever is able to come in and react to that. Whatever I see it, where I hope it is going is we will have more regulations and standards around this, so the companies will actually know, on the developer side, actually know at least the basic standards to hold themselves against. I'm hoping that there is going to be a regulation around this, not only for obviously HR, but across the board, whether it's improving the anti-discrimination legislation and doing that catch up with the technology, or whether it's an overarching AI technology across all industries on the basic levels and doing some enforcement around that. But on the soft side, I think there needs to be a lot of training and advocacy, and my push, my personal push around this is, as a consumer, as a citizen, as an employee within these companies, raising that awareness and pushing for change. And how do we raise awareness on these populations, on citizens and consumers, is where the soft piece is going to come in.
Sure. Makes sense. Carin, what do you think as a...
Yeah. So, I mean, I would add just a couple things. One is I do believe that there's got to be more consistency in the processes that we're using, right, to evaluate whether or not there's bias in technology. So I do think that thinking about it from a regulation standpoint and make sure that there is consistency across, that technology platform, I think is going to be really important. I think the other thing, though, is transparency. Yep. What are we seeing that's working and what are we seeing that's not working? And how do we learn from those stories so that we can come together and really better the technology for everyone, right? And not just I think a lot of times, and I think about this a lot in diversity, that we often think that we're competitors in certain spaces where what we need to be doing is coming together and solve a bigger, broader problem, as opposed to just thinking about it for our one company or industry or whatever. And so pulling people together and thinking about the consistency, making sure that those stories are clear and that they are transparent, I think it's going to be what goes a long way. So instead of kind of hiding what we don't know, how do we bring to light that we don't know it and that it's a problem that we have to solve for?
Yep. Great. Well, that's a great segue into how do you educate the workforce on mitigating bias, and how do you ensure that both best technologies and best practices are adopted? Do you have any thoughts on that, Carin? I'm sure you've had a lot of experience with that.
I probably have too many thoughts on it, but I'll start with this. The first thing for me is education. How do you educate people around what bias is? How does it impact their decision making? And then how do you try to mitigate it? But I will say that you cannot stop at educating people. You have to allow people to practice, to fail, and to get better, right? So you can't just assume that because you've taken your organization, through unconscious bias training, that it's going to solve all of your needs. The other thing too is that I think we need to start looking at unconscious bias through our entire employee life cycle. It can't just be in the hiring practice. It can't just be in the decision-making practice. But how do you think about it in terms of every single element or aspect of how it's impacting the experiences of people who may be trying to come into your companies? And then I think the last thing that I would just say is that, back to the point around making sure that you have some element of diversity and difference in how you are looking at bias and how you are approaching it, allows for you to make sure that you're tackling it from different angles and not just assuming that I've gotten this one training program and it's going to do everything I need to do around bias, but thinking about how you continually evolve just beyond that education piece, I think is super critical.
And if I can just say one thing about unconscious bias training, and again, as a scientist, I read all sorts of meta-analyses, the data are not very good, unfortunately, on the effectiveness. And so I think that that's just one thing to keep in mind, is they did a 15-year, study of all the unconscious bias, diversity trainings, and it essentially found they were ineffective in actually changing behavior, right? And I think that that's and I think we should can continue to do them to raise awareness, but unfortunately that system one thinking doesn't really get changed by that. And so I do think that that's where focusing on behavior and metrics is really critical, because all these trainings are helpful in sort of awareness raising, but then may not end up, it's all part of what you're saying, Carin, in some real meaningful change, right? So
you're exactly right, Frida. It's like that was to my point around, you can't just start with you can't just stop with the education. That's not enough. And I think part of the challenge has been not enough work has been done on the how do you mitigate it side, and how do you mitigate it within us as humans. The part that's hard, that's the behavior part that's getting that's harder. And so as we think about the use of technology, that's why technology is so important. But technology cannot remove all the biases that we are forced to make decisions on. And so I think that's where it's an and, right? It's a both.
It's definitely an, for sure.
It's not just the education, it's not just the technology, it's a combination.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Merve, what would you think in terms of what are best practices in terms of both technology and just general practice?
Just in general, following up on the diversity of perspectives and multidisciplinary teams and multidisciplinary perspectives in the development, as well as the implementation cycle of these products or even services, is crucial. Continuously reviewing the implementation and results, because with the best of intentions, with the best design and development, you might still have unintended consequences. You don't know until sometimes when it's released into the wild. And just following up on those consequences, giving a way to for the implementers, as well as in this case for candidates and applicants, to raise their concerns. I've been exposed to this, and this is how the system reacted. This part of your process was biased. Kind of giving that way for feedback, so you can improve both your processes as well as the software.
Yep, That's I couldn't agree more. And I'm just going to make one plug for, and it's not really a plug. It's actually a little bit of a thorn. I personally think that one of the challenges is that employment is a space where people fear discovery very much, if that makes sense, right? A lot of times transparency would be good, right? Let's be transparent about our processes. But unfortunately, and again, I don't mean to call out lawyers, but lawyers then say, oh, but what if we find something we don't like? And it's like, well, we were never going to make progress if we can't look and find something we don't like. And I think that it's a true problem. And I've heard this from other HR professionals as well. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, Carin, but they're like, well, we want to be more transparent, but, sort of the legal framework makes it, so challenging that we were advised against it. So I'm not going to say I have a solution. I just think that generally speaking, I think transparency is at odds with some of the legal frameworks, and we got to think about that. We have some great questions coming from the audience, so I'll throw these out to you guys. Kathy Neal from the previous panel says, can you provide some examples of achieving successful change in bias? Who wants to take that one?
I'll give some examples with some of the consultancy work that I've done with developers. Whether it's the engineering background or whether it's the company culture or whether it's some of the pressures in terms of delivering a product. Dev teams don't necessarily have the time or the knowledge of going into some of the structural, debating some of the issues. So when I start talking with the dev teams, development teams, what is the context of where you get your data, when you're building this software, how was the data collected, what's the history behind it, is it applicable to the software that you're trying to build, whether it's from you're trying to build a off-the-shelf product or whether you're customizing it for your customers. Kind of talking them through that and talking the different types of biases where it can leak into the system, creep into the system, and talking about context of data. It's like if you're strictly looking at this, there are some historical, racial, or structural injustices inbuilt within this data. So once people see that, they kind of stop and, like, if they want to hear it. They stop and kind of think, okay, we haven't thought about this. Even in our education, in our training, nothing of this sort was mentioned. So kind of doing those interventions, and I've seen success.
Carin, go ahead.
Sorry, the only thing I was going to add is to think about how you continue to measure the impacts of either the training or whatever it is you're doing, continuing to measure that. So if you're not seeing change in the outcomes that you're searching for, then whatever you're doing is not working, and you need to continually think about how you change that.
Yep. We have two more questions. I'm going to try to squeeze both of them in. So quickly, does anyone have any thoughts on the impact of unconscious bias in the adjudication of background checks? Any? Yeah, go for it.
I do. There are a lot of softwares out there or vendors out there that do background checks, social media background checks, especially social media background checks for the hiring process. Some of this is illegal in certain states, certain countries, because what happens is, especially if you're using this ahead of the hiring decision, you get access to all the information. You're not protected attributes. Supposed to base your decision at, so you can see if someone has a disability, if someone is pregnant, if someone has a certain political stand, or from a different ethnicity. So if you have 2-3 candidates that at the very end of your decision, and you're going to pick one, and you're running this background checks, you cannot unsee what you've seen.
Sure.
You cannot unknown what you just learned. So your decision is going to be by that.
Great. And then very quickly, Mariana wants to know, what are thoughts on hiring for skills versus potential versus competencies when it comes to inclusion? I will say one thing, that generally potential is far less subject to societal bias than skills. People's potential is much more equally distributed, unfortunately, or fortunately, than our skills, because then our skills are subject to societal pressures. But hand it off to we're at time. But maybe, Carin, if you have some thoughts on that.
Really quickly, I do believe that hiring for both skills and potential is critical in the process, especially as you're looking for diverse talent, and also acknowledging that we don't learn the same way. We don't come from the same institutions, and how people learn can be very different. Nowadays, almost anyone can go and become an engineer simply by going onto the web and learning, right? And so just assuming that there's only one way for people to learn and get the skills that they have, you need to start thinking beyond that. And we need to start kind of looking in the same box and assuming that success looks one way, right? Success can come from many different areas, and so can the skills that people learn to get there.
Absolutely. So Dave, I think we're at time. I don't know if you're going to join us. Waiting for you to pop onto the screen. Oh, there you are.
Yes. Excellent. Yeah, we wanted to give the last minute to answer that question.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Frida, Merve, Carin, thank you so much. Everyone, we are rounding into the home stretch here for the rest of the day. We have another panel in this space starting in 4 minutes. This one is focused on from referrals to retention, looking within to leverage your workforce's diversity. So fantastic transition point. We'll actually have a really interesting conversation around the double-edged sword that can be employee referrals and thinking about that side of the process. So sit tight for that. Additionally, I did want to call out, again, thank you to Frida and the Pymetrics team, along with Seek Out, for helping to match donations to Code 2040, an incredible organization working towards racial equity in technology. So the details of donations are pinned. If you are able to donate, they are there. Don't forget to sign up for a free t-shirt because they're really beautiful and cool and a good way to commemorate the day. And sit tight. We have a couple more amazing talks. Torin's Q&A session at 4 p.m. To close the sort of formal programming. It's going to be really, really powerful, especially if you weren't able to catch him in the morning. These last few minutes with him are going to be really, really powerful. And then we should have a great wind down with views from Serbia, from Austria, from Tijuana, Mexico, as travel writers are going to take you into their home and show you around and give you a chance to really be transported, even though we're all stuck in our houses in the middle of July. So great stuff happening today still. Thank you for a really powerful conversation. I mean, this is why we bring people together to talk about these issues and how technology can impact them. So Merve, Frida, Carin, thank you. Everyone, sit tight, and you will see my face again in just a few minutes as we get ready for the next panel. Thanks, everyone.